Halloween is coming up this week, and we really wanted to do something about horror movies. But I couldn't really think of the exact right way to frame it, because last year we did the top 10 best horror movies according to me. So we have our friend Joe, who's been really helping us out in the RetroBlasting arena, and he's been posting daily horror movies on the Facebook page, and so he has a lot of knowledge about horror movies, unlike Michael, who is really not into horror movies at all. So we thought it'd be really fun to sit down and talk, just Joe and I, about our favorite horror movies and our experiences with them. So stay tuned.
So Melinda, what started your interest in the horror genre?
I would say I had seen several horror movies before this, but the first movie that I remember just being completely in love with was Nightmare on Elm Street, which is, I've said is my favorite horror movie. And I think, me and my friend Olivia watched it. I remember we were probably around 12 years old, and we sat in a dark room in my living room watching it late at night, and then she had to walk home. Now, we lived on a military base in Alaska, and so, I walked her home because we were both like, oh my God! And so I'm walking her home, but then I had to walk back to my house alone, and I was completely petrified.
The terror built in your mind.
Yeah,
as
yeah,
you
I just kept thinking about it all,
streets.
and I was thinking about Tina walking along, and he was coming after her, and I mean, I had nightmares forever, and I just thought that it was so cool because it was, that adrenaline thing, as well as the idea that your nightmares could become real, and I always had really bad nightmares,
Sure.
so it really resonated with me.
Sure.
So what about you? What hooked you?
I've got to go back to watching Pet Sematary in my cousin's basement.
Yeah.
And this was probably on Betamax, very early on.
Wow.
And, we're all lying there as these, 10, 11, 12-year-olds watching this movie. And somebody grabbed me from behind at one of the most terrifying moments, and I swear I leapt 3 feet off the floor.
And screamed like a girl.
And it was just the buildup of, like you said, adrenaline and suspense and the terror within your mind.
Right.
It made it so that I fell in love with the genre.
Why do you think the 80s were so big for horror?
I think the 80s really excelled at taking the psychological horror that had been set up in the 60s and 70s and really building on it with the evolution of the practical effects. Mm-hmm. You had movies like The Thing, not CGI. It was all, built in a model shop, and it was the fear, the terror was live in front of you. It wasn't just something that you had to imagine and emote and act out. And I think that really aided in bringing that fear and that scare across to the viewers.
Right.
How about you? What sets the 80s apart for you?
I think that, like you said, the 70s sort of really paved the way in because you had really big directors.
Sure.
You doing really good films that were artistically good films, like The Exorcist.
Right.
And things like that. And not to say that any of our favorite movies, Nightmare on Elm Street or Friday the 13th, that they were masterpieces of cinema. But those 70s films certainly whetted the audience's appetite for horror movies.
Definitely.
And then you've got the excess of the 80s, along with the technology getting to a point where they could sort of do a little bit more with that components. They weren't limited to things like they were in, say, the 60s,
Right.
where you just had to, not show the monster at all. And that was how it was scary. So it was also before things got to where they are now, where you show everything all the time because you've got CGI, and that almost makes it less scary. So it was kind of at this apex of, we can show enough to make it scary, but,
Right.
There's still this supernatural
Right.
component in there, which is kind of cool.
And I would say the overabundance of CGI it lessens the terror because they show so much. It pulls your imagination out because it feeds you everything that they want you to see instead of letting you just see it in your head and build upon it internally.
Let's talk vampires.
I would say I'm personally a bigger fan of the Hammer films with Peter Cushing and Christopher Lee.
Okay.
Where Dracula was the clear and defined villain. He was the horror element. And Nosferatu, where, this is the being from the night that creeps upon you while you're sleeping and that builds the terror. as vampires became more popular as a film subject matter, I think filmmakers tried to make the vampires more sympathetic to the viewer. Even if we look into Interview with a Vampire, you know, people loved Lestat, even though he was supposed to be the main villain, I guess you could say, in the film. Right. He was still a more sympathetic character than, I would say, Nosferatu or Dracula from the Hammer films. Sure. And as the vampire continued to become more popular, they became love interests, and they became, the person that you wanted to be, not the person or the being that you feared the most. Mm-hmm. And I know this kind of ties into some of your interests. So, how do you feel about the evolution of the vampire film?
Well, I think vampire films are super interesting because, to me, they kind of represent what we fear about ourselves. Where, like we talked about earlier, zombie films sort of talk about what we fear in society, but vampires sort of show what we fear within ourselves.
Right.
And so I think that films like, and I'm not saying The Lost Boys is the first one, but The Lost Boys was an early one to sort of try to take the vampire idea and market it to like a teen audience, because teens were watching a lot of horror movies. And infusing a little bit of comedy, and then that was picked up on by like Buffy the Vampire Slayer, which was tremendously popular. I'm not just talking about the movie, I mean the series.
Right.
And so there's something about that, idea of being attracted to the darkness and attracted to the bad boy and attracted to that dark side. But like you said, vampires became really popular. So filmmakers and storytellers are looking at, okay, well, how can I make a story about a vampire if they're completely evil? What do you think about the whole new zombie craze?
I've been a zombie fan from day one. I've always loved the Romero films. Night of the Living Dead, iconic. Will always be the trendsetter for me for those films. I will base my judgment on any film off of that movie.
And what did you like about that movie?
It was just really scary.
Mm-hmm.
It was terrifying. You couldn't go anywhere. You weren't safe anywhere. You had to, fortify and just hope that, the day or the time would come that you could, emerge from your little hole and, find yourself in a better place. And it was just that mystery of not knowing.
Yeah.
And not being able to go outside.
Mm-hmm.
That really set the tone for me.
It took the idea of pod people,
right,
and made it more of like a monster, because the whole invasion idea, you don't really know who it is, but in this case you do know who it is. Exactly. But it doesn't diminish the terror at all. Like you're, like you said, you're pretty much every single place you go, every single thing you do to try to survive becomes just fraught with this, suspense and anxiety, and you can't help but just be like, oh, my palms are sweating, I can't stand it. But it's awesome.
Well, you had mentioned that vampires, the vampire genre, really based its fear on the evil within,
mm-hmm.
and not knowing, how you were going to, react or overcome this evil.
Right.
And you said that the highlight of the zombie genre is that it's not the evil within, it's the evil within, or in society. It's the evil around you that you can't control.
Yeah, it's sort of like, you look at the earlier zombie movies like White Zombie,
right?
Things like that, and you've got like a voodoo witchcraft type of thing, which was at that time what people didn't understand, couldn't comprehend, hadn't figured out the answer for, right? And then, you take Romero, who really, took the zombie thing and ran with it.
Right.
That sort of turned it into more of like that was sort of Cold War era. So you're looking at like warfare, or, something happened where they dropped some sort of bomb on us, or something happened that's related to technological advancement.
Right.
How is that going to be our downfall, right? Because during that time, everything was, technology is going to be our downfall. and then it sort of becomes, it mutates into like a virus type of thing, which now is super relevant, you know, with, you know, Ebola and, you know, all of whatever the virus of the week is. So now I think zombies are being interpreted more as, you know, carriers of some sort of plague.
Infection.
Exactly. Which you definitely can't get away from. You can't run away from that.
Right.
So what do you think? I mean,
I know there's a big debate in the zombie community, as one would say, that films like 28 Days Later and 28 Weeks Later and World War Z aren't really zombie films because it's not the undead, it's the infected. And where do you draw the line between, you know, the risen dead and somebody who's become infected, like you said, by a plague or some kind of a virus and has changed, not necessarily through death, but just through infection.
Right.
I really don't have an issue with either. I think the infection model works best with our, you know, current environment because, I mean, there are infections that are spreading across the world, and this is a, you know, what would happen or what could happen if something like this develops. Keeping in with the zombie subgenre, I guess. Zombie. Felucci's zombie film from the early 80s is considered to be one of the best early installments in the zombie subgenre. So what do you think about some of the other Italian influences in the horror genre in general?
It's a great question. I think, you know, a lot of people mentioned a lot of the Italian horror movies during my last top 10 horror movie thing.
Right.
And I know in college, that's when I really, really delved into some deep cuts of of horror movies, including a lot of the Italian, you know, Dario Argento and Fulci's movies and stuff like that. Some of those run together in my mind now because it's been such a long time since I've seen any of them, but I think that if I had to sort of sum up what I think of the Italian horror movies, it's just that they're very raw and brutal. Like there's this one that's stayed with me ever since I saw it, and it's called Burial Ground.
Okay.
And it's like these people, and they go to this old house to stay. I don't remember all the details, but I do remember that there's this kid who has like this weird like sexual attraction to his mother, and he's constantly trying to get with her. Certainly in this one scene, and then like he's old enough to walk and talk, and I actually don't think he was portrayed by a kid. If I remember correctly, he was portrayed by a little person or something like that, and he ends up trying to breastfeed from her, even though he's like a walking, talking 8 or 9 year old kid in the context of the film, and he's a zombie at that point, and he bites off. It's so over the top in the inappropriateness, you know, like. That you're just watching almost not for the horror anymore, like we talked about. It's not the suspense. You can't look away.
The shock value.
Oh my God! Like
exactly.
It's the shock value, which now is plentiful, like Human Centipede. It's like, you know, it's just, oh my God, you know, what disgusting thing can they come up with next? But I think a lot of other movies, not to say that that's the epitome of the Italian horror movie genre. I just think that's kind of what I walk away with. That brings me to asking you about what's something that we've talked about before, which is Scream and the whole 90s. Like, we talked about the 80s a minute ago, so then the 90s kind of moves into more of like this, you know, I'm gonna kind of do this hipster spin on horror and kind of like, I'm gonna be super ironic about the horror.
I think the whole mindset of the horror fan in the 90s was that, okay, we've seen everything from the 80s, now we're too smart for any of this stuff to actually happen.
Right.
We know all of the gimmicks, we know all of the tricks. You don't go down the dark hallway, you know.
You don't split the party.
There are signs that, you know, if you see this, I'm too smart, I'm not gonna go that way. I figured this out because I've seen so many horror movies.
Yeah.
So the Scream series really takes that whole social commentary and says, well, you may know all of these things, but there are workarounds. We can still have this horror or this violence, this evil.
Yeah.
And you may think that you know how to get out of it alive, but sometimes it's still going to get you.
Well, so my I guess one of my issues with Scream is that it follows the pattern of many films that come after that, which is there's no supernatural villain.
Right.
It's just these two guys like killing people. So it's like Columbine, but but different. You see what I'm saying?
It's
like,
always
it's not...
an elaborate scheme
right.
that happens to just bypass anybody's efforts to thwart it.
Exactly.
They just happen to keep going.
Saw or Hostel or these things. It's like, okay, well, it's not like a demon or anything like that. It's really just some crazy psychopath, which I guess in our modern times is the more scary thing, because we don't believe in monsters now. What do you think in terms of the future of horror movies? Like, what would you like to see? If you could see it go in any particular direction, what would be the coolest thing that you could see?
I am such a fan of the traditional.
Yeah.
That I don't know, until the new concept comes out, I don't know that I can see anything out there personally that I think is going to help evolve the genre itself. The supernatural ghost or possession subgenre, it continues to progress, and I think it's because it's just one of those things that you can't explain, so you can take it in many different directions. You can have the possession films, you can have the the environmental films like Amityville and Poltergeist, where the ghost is around you, and do you stay and try to tough it out, or do you flee for your life and throw away all of your belongings in the process? There's not one specific take on the supernatural film that is more right
Supernatural, which to me I would say is the only thing that comes to my mind when I think of, is there anything that's out there being currently produced that's like classically horror? I think that it may have kind of gotten off track at this point, but certainly in its first 5 seasons or so, it was very much about like, let's go back to the roots of horror. And I know it's a TV show, but I mean, that's the only thing I could think of.
Well, and as a huge fan of the zombie culture, I love The Walking Dead. Mm-hmm. But in the show, and in the books itself, the biggest evil is not necessarily the zombies. No. It's not necessarily the walkers that have taken over the world. It's these other people.
It's the other humans.
The other factions, that are just out there trying to survive.
Which I think is so reminiscent of Day of the Dead. Because by that point the zombies weren't as much the issue. They were there, but the other humans were It's again the social, what's out there socially. So, we are our own worst enemy.
What lengths are we willing to go to as humans to defend ourselves or to survive? Mm-hmm. Do you still, how much of your moral compass do you hold on to, or do you broaden your horizons?